Ciao, oggi per interviste antidiplomatiche siamo in compagnia di Kevork Almassian, che è un giornalista indipendente che analizza la situazione in Siria sin dall'inizio del 2011, ovvero da quando il paese è stato aggredito da bande di mercenari che lo hanno distrutto, sino all'epilogo di queste settimane, quando a inizio dicembre una coalizione di sigle terroristiche con a capo HTS, l'ex Al-Qaeda siriana, sono riuscite a spodestare Assad e a conquistare il paese. Grazie Kevork per la disponibilità a questa intervista. Oggi quindi parleremo di Siria e di Medioriente, di come cambia lo scenario nell'area dopo la caduta appunto di Assad. Lo faremo però partendo dalla fine di questa triste storia, ovvero dagli scenari che la Siria e i paesi limitrofi dovranno affrontare nei prossimi mesi e anni. Allora, Kevork, come già ho accennato, in meno di 15 giorni l'offensiva dei ribelli terroristi di Idlib ha rovesciato il governo legittimo di Assad, conquistando la Siria e imponendo in pochi giorni un governo provvisorio che sta ottenendo il riconoscimento internazionale. Se non fosse che a capo di questo governo c'è Al-Jolani, che è stato fino a pochi giorni fa un terrorista ricercato dagli Stati Uniti. Quindi, se non fosse semplicemente per questo, verrebbe da acclamare questa rivoluzione come un grande cambiamento positivo per la Siria. Io intanto ti chiedo chi sono coloro che hanno conquistato il potere in Siria e che cosa sta succedendo nel paese.
The nature of the insurgency always has been an Islamist in its nature. So the outcome of the insurgency now that HTS, what they call HTS in Arabic, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it's an umbrella of different Islamist groups under which fights different militias. Most notoriously or most famously is the Al-Nusra Front or the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. The leader of the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria was Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, or what they call him now Ahmad al-Shara, and he rebranded himself with the help of the regional intelligence and also with the American support to rebrand himself into a rebel leader, similar to what they did with Osama bin Laden in the 80s when they portrayed him again as a freedom fighter against the Soviet Union. Now, in my opinion, the start of the Al-Nusra Front in Syria was in 2012, which was not surprising during the start of this insurgency against Syria. And the people or the groups who wanted to carry out the fight against Assad were mostly Islamists. They were motivated to fight against him for different reasons, one of which is, of course, they portrayed or they saw Assad as someone who belongs to a minority religious sect, and they wanted to remove him for religious reasons. The second factor is, of course, the ideological reasons, the indoctrination, and the funding they received from various sources, most notably Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United States and the UK. They received tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons and ammunition in order to topple Assad. Now, why they wanted to do that? For also multiple reasons, one of which is the position of Syria in what used to be called the axis of resistance. So via Syria, the alliance of Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine used to have a strategic depth against the Israeli occupation or the American dominance in the region. So they wanted to break Syria for that reason. We also had other important reasons, for example, the energy. Syria has a huge gas now in the Mediterranean, something that Turkey has been eyeing on, and similarly Israel. And now that Assad is gone, we see that one of the first demands of Turkey is to draw the maritime borders, because Turkey wants to have an access to the gas and fuel in the Mediterranean. And similarly, Qatar wants to extend gas pipelines through Syria to Turkey, and Turkey would distribute this gas to Europe. And at the same time, they wanted to kick out the Russian fleet from the Mediterranean. So I would argue this was more for geopolitical reasons, but the groups who were ready to sacrifice and pay a big price, let's say in a huge war against the Assad government, were the Islamists, because they were ideologically, religiously motivated, and some of which were only motivated by money. So if I want to draw a distinction, there are two major groups now, or two major umbrellas fighting who fought against Assad. One of them is what is called the Syrian National Army, and this is directly supported by the Turkish intelligence. They're mostly mercenaries. They're fighting for money. And we have also HTS, under which the strongest army is Al-Nusra Front. They've also motivated, some of them by money, but mostly by ideology and religion and the concept of martyrdom. So now that Assad is replaced, his replacement has been the founder of the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who was also one of the active members of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, when he went to Iraq and he participated in the acts of sectarian violence against the Shia community in Iraq, and he started sending car bombs to the Shia mosques and Shia neighborhoods in order to cause a sectarian strife and sectarian war in Iraq itself. So I would argue that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani has been and still is an American asset, starting from Iraq in 2003, because after the occupation, the United States wanted to increase the sectarian tensions in the country in order to divide and conquer the country. So the types of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani played a major role. And after, when they were finished with Iraq, now he has become the leader of the so-called insurgency, which was an Al-Qaeda-led insurgency against Assad. And now he is the de facto leader of Syria. But ironically, you see that all these powers who claim that they are championing human rights and democracy in Syria, those are the ones who first supported and then endorsed the outcome of the regime change, which means they're happy with the leadership of the Al-Qaeda offshoot of Syria, of Damascus. And because they told us that they fight against Assad because he was a dictator, but now they have replaced a dictator with another dictator, plus a theocracy, which will definitely destabilize the country even further.
Come descriveresti la situazione in Siria al momento? Perché Al-Jolani ha detto che non appoggia le vendette settarie, ma da quello che vediamo la situazione sembra abbastanza diversa. È davvero un governo illuminato o quello a cui stiamo assistendo è la continuazione di quanto hanno fatto i terroristi sin dall'inizio della guerra, ovvero uccidere chiunque essi ritengano infedele o filo Assad?
So Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, he says that he doesn't want to be part of any sort of sectarian violence. However, when I see his statements and then I see the actions on the ground, they're completely contradictory. They are 180 degree the opposite of what he claims to be pursuing in Syria. So he came when he conquered Damascus. There was a big panic among the what they call the minorities in Syria, because I also don't like the term minority, because when you say minority as if they are alien to the Syrian society, no, everyone constitutes Syrian people. And religions are sub-identities and not the main identity. This is how it should be in any nation state. So Syrians are from different religions and sects, but HTS, Al-Qaeda, Ahrar Sham, Islam Army, etc., 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 they see Syria as a majority of Muslim Sunnis and minorities. And in their understanding of what democracy means is that the majority should rule over the minority, but this is the dictatorship of the majority. But this also means that they don't believe in a national identity. If they believed in a national identity, they wouldn't speak about majorities and minorities. So this is the difference between a secular political system under Assad, which believed in a national identity and everyone is equal in front of the law, compared to the HTS Islamist group, which believes in the Islamic nature of the country, and this means that everyone who doesn't adhere to the principles of HTS, whether religiously or ideologically, they are going to be considered second-class citizens or even opponents. So in this case, some people may think that this violence is exclusive against the minorities, and this is, in the bigger sense of it, is true, because the motivation of HTS against the minorities is that you have a Christian community, they don't consider them an integral part of the Syrian society. You have the Kurds; they don't consider them a part of the Syrian society they are trying to establish, or the state. And you have the Druze, and you have the Alawites, and you have the Shiites, and you have the Yazidis, and you have the Jews. You have so many different shades and forms of communities in Syria that HDS doesn't consider them as part of the state that they are wishing to establish. Now, they could use some of the personalities among these communities as we call a decoration for their system to say, no, we are also diversity friendly, as the British press is trying to polish and rebrand HDS, for example. However, on the ground, the violence, the killing, the summary executions, the humiliation, the decapitations, the slaughtering that is happening on the ground all indicate that this sectarian violence is deliberate. It is deliberate, and Abu Muhammad al-Jolani doesn't want to stop it. Why? For a very simple reason. Now, in order to establish an Islamic state, you need to have at least an absolute majority. Now, while Syria is 90% are Sunnis, Sunni Muslims, however, we have also big portion of them are Kurds, and they don't accept to live under Jolani rule. We also have a big secular Sunni society or community in Syria, which they don't want to live under Al-Qaeda rule. So for al-Jolani, in order to have a strong grip over the state institutions and establish the Islamic state that he has in his mind on the long run, first he has to commit as many sectarian violence against what he calls the minorities in the country in order to push these minorities into isolation and send them into cantons. And once you have cantons in the country, you have clear sectarian lines, divisions in the country, that the Alawites are only in the coast, for example, and the Druze are exclusively living in Asweda, and the Kurds are exclusively living on the eastern shore of the Euphrates instead of having an homogeneous society. And this is the phase that precedes the Balkanization of Syria. Once you push everyone into a canton, and like the Armenians are living, let's say, in a spot like this, and the Sunnis and the Shias, everybody has its own geographical entity, then this will be easier for them to divide the country. And this is the end goal of what I call the imperialists in Syria. And they want to divide the country into 4 or 5 parts. Now, 100 years ago, when Sykes and Picot, who used to be the representatives, the officers, the French and the British officers who divided the Middle East, the main reason for it was to have spheres of influence for the British occupation and the French occupation. And at the same time, it is the best way to divide and conquer on the region. So after the redrawing of the Middle Eastern map 100 years ago, this is the second attempt to divide the countries even further in the region, because the experience of the pan-Arabists or some of the left-wing parties or the nationalist parties in the region has proven to the imperialists that there is always this urge for liberation among the Arab people. And once there is this urge of liberation among the Arab people, there is going to be someone like Jamal Abdel Nasser. There's going to be someone like Hafez al-Assad. There's going to be someone like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or who tried to bring as many Arabic countries together as possible, whether through geographical unity or through economic integration, so that this region could thrive again. But since this region is decided by the imperialists to keep it poor and to keep it underdeveloped in order to for the empire represented by the US, now also Europe is part of it basically, and Israel in the region, they need these divisions in the region because it makes it easier for them to conquest. And one last thing, why do they want to Balkanize Syria? Now, Syria has been a secular country under which around 20 different religious and ethnic and sectarian communities lived in and coexist, and they in a harmonious way. And there were no sectarian violence against each other. And this represented a model in the region that a pan-Arabist country under which all these communities can live and coexist under one political system is possible. But Israel wants to present itself as an ethno-religious country in the region, and being an ethno-religious country in the region, it has become really unaccepted and unwelcomed by many other countries. So you see that once Syria is divided, then Israel will also say, look, all my neighbors in Lebanon, in Syria, are divided on sectarian, ethnic, and religious lines. You have an Alawite state, you have a Druze state, you have a Kurdish state, you have a Sunni state, you have an Islamic state. Then why not Israel is the state only for the Jewish people? So this is also could be one of the factors why the Israelis are interested in this Balkanization of Syria, again as a phase that precedes their attempt to create Greater Israel. And we can see the result on the ground nowadays that Israel is advancing inside Syria. Israeli occupation forces are only 20 kilometers away from Damascus. They have occupied all the water resources in the south. They have occupied the water dams. They have occupied the higher hills. So they have now an absolute dominance militarily, and also the natural resources of Syria in the south over the rest of the Syrians. And I would argue that this is not going to stop here. Israelis are going to further occupy more territories in the south, and they want to try to open a corridor with Asweda or with the Druze and also with the Kurds in preparation for the Balkanization of Syria.
Il futuro della Siria è legato ormai ai poteri degli stati confinanti, da Israele alla Turchia. Chi ha spinto a tuo avviso per il cambiamento di regime e cosa ti aspetti che succeda nei prossimi mesi? Il governo di HTS a tuo avviso resisterà alle tensioni interne e soprattutto si prospetta, secondo la tua analisi, uno scenario più simile a quello libico, cioè ovvero di guerre tribali e di ulteriore divisione del paese, o uno scenario più afghano in cui il governo si consolida e avvia una transizione del paese verso uno o l'altro schieramento in questo contesto politico multipolare?
First of all, we see that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani says there is not going to be elections in Syria for the next 4 years, which means he is going to be the de facto leader of Syria for another 4 years, because he claims that redrafting the constitution will take 3 years. And that's absurd, because redrafting the constitution could take 6 months maximum and not longer. And if they want to, they can draft a new constitution. But what they want to do before that is, if they draft a constitution and there is elections and the new government come, then they would be voting over strategic agreements, which Abu Muhammad al-Jolani wants to strike with neighboring countries now. For example, Turkey wants to draw the maritime borders with Syria. If they do it now under the Jolani, before elections and before redrafting the constitution, this is going to be a binding agreement. So Turkey wants to pass and impose certain agreements on Syria through Jolani before any government comes in power. Similarly with Israel. Once Israel occupies the large swath of territories they have already done, it's bigger than the Gaza Strip, they will never withdraw, whether a government comes or elections or anything else. I think the scenario that is I would say close or could resonate with Syria is the Lebanese or the Iraqi examples, which means that more sectarian violence will happen, unfortunately, in the country, and every community will isolate itself into cantons, and then everybody will start calling for international powers to come and protect them. We can see already calls on social media platforms by different let's say, activists and journalists belonging to certain groups in Syria calling for international protection against such massacres. And I think this is the goal. The goal is to create security conditions in the country, and especially threats against the minority groups in the country, so that the minority groups would ask the protection of foreign powers. And that means that if something like this happens, I think Jolani will present or pose absolute or definite threat against the Druze and against the Kurds. And this will push the Druze and the Kurds into the arms of Israel and the United States even more. And this is what the Americans and the Israelis want in the country. They create a problem and then they present a solution for the people. And the solution in this case is basically a mandate power over these religious groups. And the Alawites are probably going to do the same. And the Christians and every other religious or ethnic group, they will ask for a foreign power to protect them against HTS. So HTS is a destructive power. It destroys communities, it destroys states. It cannot build a state. And this is what is planned for Syria. It is planned for Syria to destroy the Syrian society, its civilization, its history. And this explains why ISIS, al-Nusra, HTS, and other groups all focused on the ancient cities in Syria in the past decade. Like they want to destroy Palmyra. Why do they want to destroy Palmyra? What strategic importance lies in Al-Palmyra? Why do they want to occupy and destroy Ma'lula, which is an ancient Christian city? Because they want to destroy and eliminate the history and the civilization of Syria, which preceded the Islamic conquest of the country. And here I'm not saying anything against Islam. In the contrary, what I'm saying is history of Syria is 7,000 years old, and it's not only 1,400 years. So we have to go back before Islam itself for 1,000 years if we want to speak about the true rich history of Syria. So it's multifaceted and multifolded strategy, like trying to destroy the civilizational value of Syria, the history, the languages, for example, the Aramaic in the country. And at the same time, they're trying to create mini states in the country. First, they will propose a federal system. And I'm not against a federal system per se, in the contrary. But federal system is I'm a supporter of a federal system if it unites and unifies different Arabic countries economically or politically or geographically or socially, etc., etc., etc. For example, if there is a proposal for a federal system between Syria and Iraq, or Syria and Lebanon, or Syria and Palestine, or Syria and Jordan, etc., etc., then it is logical to discuss such a scenario or such a solution for the already divided region. But if we are going to present federal system to divide what was already been divided in the past, then this is going to be only a recipe for further destabilization and conflicts in the region among these different religious and ethnic communities. So if you create a so-called Islamic State led by HTS, which occupies between Aleppo, Idlib, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, and Dara, for example, and then you create another mini-state in the coast represented by the Alawites, and then in the south you have the Druze, and then in the east you have the Kurds, and you have also other mini-states by other ethnic and religious groups. This is going to be a formula of inner-state conflict among each other, because the major power, which has 40,000 fighters and armed to the teeth, and ideologically and religiously, and even, I would say, on a level of committing heinous terrorist attacks, like this is their motivation. If you have HTS and groups like HTS in the country, they will always try to subjugate the rest of the people. They will always try to terrorize the rest of the people. And this will only be a formula, a recipe for endless wars in the country. So if anyone from the European or the American officials truly care about the well-being and the safeguarding the Syria as a country, sovereign country, which has one constitution and all Syrians are equal in front of it, then they have to get rid of HTS. But this is something that they don't do because they don't want and they don't aim at creating a nation state in Syria. What they want to create is a sectarian mini states in the country, and these countries, mini states, would fight against each other. This is the formula, and were it not for it, they shouldn't recognize al-Jolani, because Jolani, like, if you put Assad on one hand, he's gone, and I'm not supporting Assad in this case, just trying to draw parallels. Like if you had Assad, who is a secular leader who was leading a political authoritarian system. And then you have al-Jolani, who himself is authoritarian, and he created an authoritarian system in Idlib. And he has this. He has also dungeons where thousands of people are rotting to death, and you have summary executions, and you have killings against women for accused of adultery, and you have examples of people getting killed, stoned to death, and you have examples after examples of ethnic cleansing and attempts of genocide against the other communities in Idlib. And above all, he's trying to create a theocracy in Syria. And I think that if you put both examples, it's impossible for anyone to, with any rational thinking or any care and love for the Syrian people, to advocate al-Jolani over Assad. I mean, Assad is gone now, but at least legitimizing and giving legitimacy to al-Jolani, in my opinion, it contradicts any calls for supporting the Syrian people. I think what they're doing is a disservice and not a service for the Syrian people.
Ok, grazie. Quindi a tuo avviso il futuro della Siria è quello di una balcanizzazione del paese e quindi della formazione di mini-stati etnici e religiosi, mi sembra di capire. Ma se allarghiamo la prospettiva, secondo te cosa cambia in Medioriente con la caduta di Assad e come si ridefiniscono i rapporti di forza tra USA e Israele e il cosiddetto asse della resistenza? Ma soprattutto ci sarà tensione, secondo te, tra Ankara e Tel Aviv in Siria?
I will start from an example from the 70s. In the 70s, after 1973 war between Egypt, Syria against Israel, the Egyptian side, Anwar Sadat, decided to go for peace negotiations with Israel. And back then, Hafez al-Assad told Anwar Sadat that the Arabic countries should go collectively for peace talks with Israel and not individually or singularly, because you cannot really, Israelis do not see the region as divided. They see it as one. They see their interest in Egypt. They see the same way they see their interest in Palestine, the same way they see their interest in Syria, and the same way in Lebanon and Jordan. So Israel doesn't see the region as divided. They see it as one. They divide it so that they can singularly deal with each of these countries, whether it's diplomatically, soft power, or hard power, which is a military means. So similarly, in my opinion, and this has proven since the 70s that this was a major strategic failure on the side of the Arabs by going to peace agreements one by one with Israel, because then Israel was able to impose favorable deals with the Arabic countries. But if the Arabs came one and they presented a deal for Israel, I think this would have presented a major win for the Arabs compared to what is the situation nowadays. So when Egypt left the Arab-Israeli conflict, there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which presented itself as the champion of the Palestinians. And starting from that point in 1979, Iran started to build the alliance of state and non-state actors in the region in order to counter the American hegemony and dominance, and especially against the Israeli occupation forces. Now, Syria joined this axis with Iran, and there has been joint military operation rooms. There has been a defensive pact among these different players in the region. And they started posing serious threat against the American dominance in the region, especially, I would argue, after 2006 war, July war against Lebanon, after which the Israelis were forced again to leave and flee the Lebanese territories, thanks to the armed group Hezbollah, and with the direct support of Syria and Iran. So I believe after that there were some changes in the way the Americans wanted to deal with the region, because this has been a red flag that an independent alliance is challenging American dominance in the region. So they started hitting each and every one of these alliances one by one again. Just the same way when Israel started striking singular deals with every Arab country, the same way Israel is now dealing or striking blows after blows after blows to every actor in the axis of resistance. And this is the price of not acting collectively against the American alliance in the region, which the US proved after October 7 that it is ready to go as far as it is possible without any conditions, without limits, against the Palestinians, even if Israel kills 100,000 or 200,000 or 1 million Palestinians, the US will support Israel, whatever. And whatever is the conditions and whatever is the circumstances or the crimes of the Israeli side. So you see, the American camp is unapologetically supports the Israeli side in the region. But on the other side, when the Hamas waged the October 7 attack, and there was a huge, let's say, reaction from the Israeli side, and they started committing a genocide in Gaza, the only party which presented some, let's say, threat against Israel was Hezbollah. Hezbollah came in support of the Palestinians, but again, every party started dealing with Israel singularly. The only thing was that Hezbollah was attacking Israel, but Israel decimated entire Gaza Strip, killed the entire leadership of Hezbollah, destroyed many villages and towns in southern Lebanon, destroyed the southern suburbs of Beirut, killed Ismail Haniyeh, and on top of it, and the worst is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So in this case, the axis of resistance led by Iran, they didn't all act again collectively against Israel. I'm not calling for violence or firing any type of weapons, etc., against Israel. I'm just explaining that this axis of resistance didn't act collectively against Israel. On the other hand, the Israelis acted collectively. Israel, the US, European countries, many European countries, I would argue, all the allies of Israel were in solidarity and in support of Israel, unlike the situation in the region where Iran at some point found itself that its president Raisi and the foreign minister has been killed in a very suspicious helicopter incident in in northern Iran, southern Azerbaijan, and then you have the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and also the assassination of the entire leadership of Hezbollah, and the destruction of Gaza, and then the regime change in Syria. So I would argue that after all this earthquakes which happened in the region, geopolitical earthquakes, I think that the balance of power has shifted dramatically in favor of the US and Israel. And with the regime change in Syria, I think this would be the end of the axis of resistance itself. And Hezbollah is forced now to become a local player in Lebanon because it doesn't have now supply chains with Syria, and it doesn't have a strategic geographical depth in Syria, which gives Hezbollah access to Iraq and to Iran. Accordingly, Hezbollah has become a local player. Yes, it has a big military power, but it cannot have reinforcement now from outside because HTS is an anti-Hezbollah force. At the same time, Gaza is destroyed, and Iran decided to, I would say, to think more about its national interests instead of becoming a regional power in the region. So in these circumstances, I think that the Americans have won this war in the region, and the main players which will have the main role in Syria are going to be Turkey, Israel, the US, and probably Saudi Arabia. But the Saudis aren't really satisfied or happy with HTS rule because they know this is a Turkish and Qatari and American intelligence construct. So I would argue that this is the perfect scenario that the Americans were planning for. Turkey would have a huge leverage over Syria, and they have a control over HTS and the other militant groups. And the Turkish side would never pose a threat against the Israelis. This is something that I'm against, this notion that Turkey is a hostile country to Israel. Turkey has a populist leader like Erdogan who has a big mouth and he champions the Palestinians verbally. But under the table, the business ties, the energy ties are ongoing with Israel. 40% of Israel's energy needs come from Azerbaijan passing through Turkey. So 40% of the war machine of Israel is operated by Azeri energy source and passing through Turkey. And even at the height and the peak of the genocide in Gaza, Turkey never stopped sending this gas and energy to Israel. So what does this tell us? This tells us that on one hand, Erdogan presents itself as a champion for the Palestinians, and on the other hand, gives the energy, the necessary energy for the Israelis to continue this onslaught against the Palestinians. I would not only call it hypocritical, but I would also say that there is an agreement between the Turkish side and the Israeli side to share the Syrian cake in this case, and the Turkish side is turning a blind eye to the occupation of Syria now by the Israeli occupation forces. And HDS says they're not interested in fighting against Israel; they just want to build start building the country and reconstruction. But Israel already achieved its goals now. The axis of resistance is crumbling. They have occupied the higher hills, the water resources in the country, and the threat against Israel from Syria has gone for the next probably few decades. So I think the biggest winners in Syria are Israel and Turkey, and Turkey will never pose a threat against Israel from the Syrian gate.
Bene, grazie. Abbiamo parlato di cosa succederà nei prossimi mesi, di come è cambiato il contesto mediorientale con la caduta di Assad, ma adesso vorrei fare un passo indietro e tornare a quei giorni in cui il portavoce dell'esercito siriano bollava tutte le notizie di ritiro dell'esercito prima da Aleppo, poi da Hama, infine da Homs come propaganda avversaria. Invece purtroppo abbiamo visto come l'esercito non abbia combattuto fino alla conquista di Damasco. Chi ha tradito secondo te? Assad, i generali, entrambi, o è vero che il governo di Assad, dopo aver vinto la guerra contro i terroristi e averli costretti a Idlib, abbia perso poi la cosiddetta pace non riuscendo a migliorare le condizioni di vita della popolazione?
I think after 2018, when the active war against terrorism was over and most of these terrorists were sent to Idlib, there was a false sense in Damascus that they have won the war, and that if they have won the war militarily, then why would they compromise politically? Why would they give up on anything that the Turkish side or the Israeli side is asking for? We won the war. Why would we give up or compromise? This was the false sense. At the same time, this year, the US, under Trump, they stopped funding the jihadists, but then they imposed draconian sanctions on the Syrian economy, which strangled the Syrian economy, basically, and devalued the Syrian lira. One of the ways the US has struck the major blow against the Syrian lira was not only the sanctions, but also holding the Syrian assets in Lebanon, which worth probably $60 billion. So the banks in Lebanon, they have taken over the Syrian money, around $60 billion, and this money belonged to Syrian businessmen and people who were using Lebanese banks for business relationship or business trades, right? Because Syria is under sanctions. So from every side, I would argue that this the government mismanagement economically, the corruption in the country, the sanctions, all these things led to the demoralization of the Syrian people. And the Syrian army is from the Syrian people. Like if I'm in the Syrian army and I have a family starving at home, and my salary, I've been serving in the army for 10 years or 7 years or 8 years, and then my salary is $30 per month after all this destruction in the country, then I don't have an appetite to fight. So I would argue on a personal level, most soldiers were not motivated to fight because uh, the economic and livelihood conditions were very dire. And this was a shared responsibility that the government mismanagement, of course, but also these draconian sanctions, I would say they're inhuman sanctions against the Syrian people. Now that Assad is gone, they're talking about lifting some of these sanctions to allow the country to reconstruct, although previously they said that these sanctions were not aimed at devastating the Syrian economy, but rather were against Assad and his close circle. And that's untrue. So the experience has proven that these sanctions have decimated the Syrian economy. So this was the first factor, I would say, that the Syrian army has been demoralized. Secondly, of course, it was an intelligence failure on the Syrian side that they couldn't predict or see or foresee this attack, which was very obvious it's going to happen. And I myself, I reported about it on September 30th. So 6-8 weeks before the attack happened against Aleppo, I predicted it with its complete with full details that this is going to happen and they're going to attack Aleppo and Jolan is going to present himself as the leader of a contract army of the United States. I spoke about this in length on my X account. This was in September last year. And it happened 1.5 months later that this attack materialized. And it happened the way I said it's going to happen because I connected the dots and I saw how the Israelis are conducting their war in Gaza and how they assassinated all the leadership of Hezbollah and what type of messages they're sending to Syria to stop supporting Hezbollah. And during this time, what is the biggest force that can pose a danger against Assad is HTS. And I know that HTS is an American Turkish intelligence construct. And I predicted that the Americans will ask for HTS to move against the Syrian army in Aleppo in order to distract the Syrian army. But I didn't anticipate and expect this fast and very quick falling of the Syrian regime. So I would argue that, so first the financial situation, the economic situation in the country, the sanctions, the intelligence failure, and also there has been, it seems, a deal among different international powers. And I would not rule out the Americans, the Israelis, the Turks, Qataris, and the Russians in this case, that they came to the conclusion that even the Russians, that Assad has become a burden probably on them because the Russians were pressing Assad to reconcile with Erdogan and they were asking him to open diplomatic, security, and all the ties again with Erdogan, and Assad refused. And why he refused? Because Erdogan refused to withdraw from Syria. And I understand the point of view of Syria back then. But if you calculate and see it more closely, Syria's position in the region has been weak. And Syria was dependent on Russian and Iranian support. And were it not for the Russian and Iranian support, Assad knows that the days of his regime is going to come to an end because they give him all sorts of support, military, energy, financial, etc. So if both of your allies, in this case Iran and Russia, are asking you to reconcile with Erdogan, I think geopolitical size of Syria was too small or too weak in this particular case to reject such demands. And it seems that the Russians probably striked a tacit deal with the Americans when it comes to Ukraine in exchange for Syria. And I'm not saying like exchanging everything, but probably some de-escalation in Ukraine. The Russians keep their fleet in the Mediterranean, and the rest is divided between the Americans, the Turks, and the Israelis. This could be the international factor why the Assad regime fall quickly. It seems also that some of the generals and some of the intelligence officers in the country were also bought by Qatar, Turkey, and the US, because in some cases there were withdrawals from some of the front lines, which was surprising and cannot be explained. I'm speaking specifically about Hama, northern Hama and Homs it was logically impossible for the Syrian army to be defeated if they fought. So there were orders given to the military, to the soldiers to withdraw, and the amount of enforcement in these front lines was so big and huge that the fighting could have lasted months. But the decision were made to withdraw. They called it a strategic retreat, and then everybody withdrew to Damascus and laid down their arms, and then Assad fled the country the same night. So I don't know if Assad is the one who was betrayed, or he betrayed, or it's a combination of factors. I don't want to say who betrayed who, but there were multiple factors which led to this situation. I would blame, of course, the previous government, Assad, for many of the failures in the country. But at the same time, I would argue that these failures were exaggerated and boosted by the foreign interference, by the intelligence covert operations, by the sanctions, by the tens of billions of worth of weapons dumped into the Syrian streets and markets. So I think that if something like this happened in any other country, like name any country in the region which can withstand 14 years of regime change war, I don't think that is possible after all this devastation.
Bene, siamo in chiusura e io vorrei chiederti ancora se le manifestazioni di resistenza da parte di ex militari dell'esercito arabo-siriano avranno una ricaduta in termini di sostegno ad HTS, o se questi episodi di attacchi alle milizie che governano in Siria possono in prospettiva aumentare e diventare appunto significativi.
I think there is what they call now the Syrian resistance against terrorism, or HTS, but the nature of the resistance and the nature of the attacks against HTS just indicate that this is more like a separate or isolated resistance movement against HTS. It's not really organized. It doesn't have military support from any power. So after laying down the arms by the Syrian army and the security apparatuses, etc., I think it would be very difficult to organize an organized resistance against HTS unless a foreign power comes and gives weapons to resistance groups in the country. If you want to organize such a movement against HTS, you need supply chains, you need salaries, you need medical aid. Yes, exactly. And I think in this case, they don't have most of these necessities. So I know who you are referring to, and I remember his name as well. I think he is from the Republican Guard of the Syrian army. But this is going to be very difficult for them to achieve any concrete, let's say, advance against the HTS, since HTS has over 40,000 fighters. 30% of them are multinational takfiris from all around the world. I think that such case needs foreign support, and if a foreign support is going to happen, it's only going to happen via Iran, and this is going to be used as more fuel on the fire in the country, because then HTS will have the best let's say, motivation to attack against the not only against the resistance but also against the community of the resistance of the civilians, by saying that they are affiliated to Iran and this is a foreign funded insurgency against a legitimate government. I mean, HTS came after foreign funded insurgency to power, but they will not tolerate any power, whether Iran or any other. I mean, I don't see any other country interested in doing that anyways. So this would be very fatal. So I would see that the Syrians in the coast especially are between two rocks, the rock of HTS, and then you have the rock of carrying out arms without supply chains, without foreign support. It's going to be very, I would say, destructive for the Syrian communities in the coast if they do that. I don't per se encourage now such resistance against HTS, because it will lead to fatal consequences for the people under such circumstances when you don't have a partner, whether local partner or regional partner or international partner, to carry out such operations against HTS. I think it's also important to see now what they're going to do with Egypt, because after toppling Syria, Qatar and Turkey and Israel will definitely eye on Egypt. And although Egypt is an ally of the US and they have struck a deal with Israel, but that's not enough for Israel. They want for Sisi to accept 2 million Palestinian refugees from Gaza, which he rejected. And I suspect that the Israelis, and via or through the cooperation with Qatar and Turkey, they would try to destabilize the Sinai region again in order to create an Islamist insurgency once again against the military, to press Sisi to accept the 2 million refugees from Gaza in order to finish the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from